So real quick, like I said, it's midnight. Benjamin's asleep, so I'm talking quietly. Hopefully the volume is up loud enough on this and you guys can hear me. So now, here's what I'm going to do here before you go on with your assignment. As I was prepping for today, I began to kind of think about certain primary sources they could bring into the lesson. And I remembered that I had a book right here called Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. I don't know if it's backwards for you guys, but it's backwards for me. But this is the autobiography of the life of Frederick Douglass, a former slave. So I'm going to read to you the first chapter. It's very short, I promise. The book, you can see, is very thin. I'm going to read you the first chapter. It is gut-wrenching, and I need a fair warning. First off, please pay attention. Please stay silent. Just listen. Just listen. You don't have to write anything about this. Please just listen and kind of try to absorb the emotion. I'm talking kind of quietly. You guys know how I like to dramatic read, so I would like to be able to use a little bit more emotion with this, but I'm trying to keep the volume down so I don't wake up the boy. But just, there's gonna be some tough moments in here. So, chapter 1, I'll read. I was born in Tuckahoe, near Hillsborough, about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen an authentic record containing it. By far the larger part of the slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs, and it is the wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant. I do not remember to have ever met a slave who could tell of his own birthday. They seldom come nearer to it than planting time, harvest time, cherry time, springtime, or fall time. So what he's saying is that any slave, they really just don't know when their birthday is other than it took place during some planting season. A want of information concerning my own was a source of unhappiness to me even during childhood. The white children could tell their ages. I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege. I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. He deemed all such inquiries on the part of a slave improper and impertinent, and evidence of a restless spirit. The nearest estimate I can give makes me now between 27 and 28 years of age. I come to this from hearing my master say, sometime during 1835, I was about 17 years old. My mother was named Harriet Bailey. She was the daughter of Isaac and Betsy Bailey, both colored and quite dark. My mother was of a darker complexion than either my grandmother or grandfather. My father was a white man. He was admitted to be such by all I ever heard speak of my parentage. The opinion was also whispered that my master was my father, but of the correctness of this opinion I know nothing. The means of knowing has been withheld from me. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I knew her as my mother. It is a common custom in the part of Maryland from which I ran away to part children from their mothers at a very early age. Frequently, before the child has reached its 12th month, its mother is taken from it and hired out on some farm at a considerable distance off, and the child is placed under the care of an old woman, too old for field labor. For what this separation is done, I do not know, unless it be to hinder the development of the child's affection towards its mother, and to blunt and destroy the natural affection of the mother for the child. This is the inevitable result. I never saw my mother, to know her as such, more than 4 or 5 times in my life, and each of these times was very short in duration, and at night. She was hired by a Mr. Stewart who lived about 12 miles from my home. She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot after the performance of her day's work. She was a field hand, and a whipping is the penalty of not being in the field at sunrise, unless a slave with special permission from his or her master to the contrary, a permission which they seldom get, and one that gives to him that gives it the proud name of being a kind master. I do not recollect of ever seeing my mother by the light of day. She was with me in the night. She would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but long before I waked, she was gone. Very little communication ever took place between us. Death soon ended what little we could have while she lived, and with it her hardships and suffering. She died when I was about 7 years old on one of my master's farms near Lee's Mill. I was not allowed to be present during her illness, at her death, or burial. She was gone long before I knew anything about it. Never having enjoyed to any considerable extent her soothing presence, her tender and watchful care, I received the tidings of her death with much the same emotions I should have felt at the death of a stranger. Called thus suddenly away, she left me without the slightest intimation of who my father was. The whisper that my master was my father may or may not be true, and true or false, it is of but little consequence to my purpose whilst the fact remains, in all its glaring odiousness, that slaveholders have ordained, and by law established, that the children of slave women shall in all cases follow the condition of their mother. And this is done obviously to administer to their own lusts and make a gratification of their wicked desires profitable as well as pleasurable. For by this cunning arrangement, the slave owner, in cases not a few, sustains to his slaves the double relation of master and father. So essentially what it just said was that the slave owners would usually keep the women kind of with him and keep all parents away, and he would use them not only for slave work but then also for, I know of such cases, and it is worthy of remark that such slaves invariably suffer great hardships and have more to contend with than others. They are, in a first place, a constant offense to their mistress. She is ever disposed to find fault with them. They can seldom do anything to please her. She is never better pleased than when she sees them under the lash, especially when she suspects her husband of showing to his mulatto children favors which he withholds from his black slaves. The master is frequently compelled to sell this class of his slaves out of deference to the feeling of his white wife, and cruel as the deed may strike anyone to be, for a man to sell his own children to human fleshmongers, it is often the dictate of humanity for him to do so. For unless he does this, he must not only whip them himself, but must stand by and see one white son tie up his brother, of but few shades darker complexion than himself, and ply the gory lash to his naked back. And if his lisp of one word of disapproval, it is set down to his parental partiality, and only makes a bad matter worse, both for himself and the slain who him would protect and defend. So he's saying the slave owners at that point would then sell their children off because they would really have no other choice. If they kept them around, they could show favoritism, and it became kind of a political issue, if you will. It became a very difficult situation, having to potentially slash, his own children. So the kids would often have to be sold into slavery, but away from him, away from the white father, just so he wouldn't have to deal with, with kind of the consequences that would involve with that. Every year brings with it multitudes of this class of slaves, meaning a bunch of half white, half black slaves. It was doubtless in consequence of the knowledge of this fact that one great statesman of the South predicted the downfall of slavery by the inevitable laws of population. Whether this prophecy is ever fulfilled or not, it is nevertheless plain that a very different looking class of people are springing up in the South and are now held in slavery from those originally brought to this country from Africa. And if their increase will do no other good, it will do away the force of the argument that God cursed Ham and therefore American slavery is right. If the lineal descendants of Ham are alone to be scripturally enslaved, it is certain that slavery at the South must soon become unscriptural, for thousands are ushered into the world annually who, like myself, owe their existence to white fathers, and those fathers most frequently their own masters. I have had 2 masters. My first master's name was Anthony. I do not remember his first name. He was generally called Captain Anthony, a title which, I presume, he acquired by sailing a craft on the Chesapeake Bay. He was not considered a rich slave owner. He owned 2 or 3 farms and about 30 slaves. His farms and slaves were under the care of an overseer. The overseer's name was Plummer. Mr. Plummer was a miserable drunkard, a profane swearer, and a savage monster. He always went armed with a cowskin and a heavy cudgel. I have known him to cut and slash the women's heads so horribly that even Master would be enraged at his cruelty and would threaten to whip him if he did not mind himself. Master, however, was not a humane slave owner. It required extraordinary barbarity on the part of an overseer to affect him. He was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slave owning. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I have often been awakened at the dawn of the day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up in a joist, and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to make an iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream, and whip her to make her hush, and not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I will remember it. I never shall forget it whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be witness and participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery through which I was about to pass. It was the most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it. This occurrence took place very soon after I went to live with my old master, and under the following circumstances. Aunt Hester went out one night, where or for what I do not know, and happened to be absent when my master desired her presence. He had ordered her not to go out evenings, and warned her that she must never let him catch her in company with a young man who was paying attention to her, belonging to Colonel Lloyd. The young man's name was Ned Roberts, generally called Lloyd's Ned. Why Master was so careful of her may be safely left to conjecture. She was a woman of noble form and of graceful proportions, having very few equals and few superiors in personal appearance among the colored or white women of our neighborhood. So he's saying she was beautiful. Aunt Hester had not only disobeyed his orders in going out, but had been found in company with Lloyd's Ned, which circumstance I found, from what he said while whipping her, was the chief offense. Had he been a man of pure morals himself, he might have been thought interested in protecting the innocence of my aunt, but those who knew him will not suspect him of such virtue. Before he commenced whipping Aunt Hester, he took her into the kitchen and stripped her from neck to waist, leaving her neck, shoulders, and back entirely naked. He then told her to cross her hands, calling her out at the same time a bad word. After crossing her hands, he tied them with a strong rope and led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist put in for that purpose. He made her get upon the stool and tied her hands to the hook. She now stood fair in his infernal purpose. His arms were stretched up at full length so that she stood upon the ends of her toes, and then he said to her, "Hold on, I'll learn how to disobey my orders." And after trolling up his sleeves, okay, I needed to double check that that I knew what was being said here. He said, "Now you blank blank, I'll learn you how to disobey my orders." And after rolling up his sleeves, he commenced to lay on the heavy cowskin, and soon the warm red blood, amid heart-rending shrieks from her and horrid oaths from him, came dripping to the floor. I was so terrified and horror-stricken at the night that I hid myself in a closet and dared not venture out long until after the bloody transaction was over. I expected it would be my turn next. It was all new to me. I had never seen anything like it before. I had always lived with my grandmother on the outskirts of the plantation, where she had put to raise the children of the younger women. I had therefore been, until now, out of the way of the bloody scenes that often occurred on the plantation.